In this video, we're taking a look at every single Nintendo 64 game that starts with the letter B. There are 25 titles in this video, so let's not waste any time. Bakuretsu Muteki Bangai-O. I've seen the Dreamcast version of Bangai-O get tons of love over the years, but I don't think too many people even know about the original version on the N64. That's probably because it was only released in Japan, and to make matters worse, only 10,000 copies of the game were ever produced. Good thing we at least got the Dreamcast version internationally because this game is awesome. Bangai-O is a 2D shooter in which you can fly around in a mech that can shoot in every direction. This is not your typical shoot 'em up though, the screen doesn't automatically scroll, you have the ability to freely explore each level at your own pace. The environments aren't huge, but they are satisfying. There's plenty of room to explore all corners of the map while you blow everything up in your way and collect as many points as you can. You get points by collecting fruit, which is dropped by enemies. There's this whole story about the bad guys illegally using a fruit to fund their evil agenda or something, but I'm not even going to go there in this video. You have two different pilots that you can switch between on the fly. One pilot shoots homing missiles, which is great for big open areas with a lot of scattered targets. The other pilot shoots a bunch of lasers that bounce off of walls. I found this to be especially useful in tight spaces and corridors. Then there's a special attack that can be charged up to unleash 100 missiles at once. Pretty epic. Each level will have you flying around blowing up everything in your wake, dodging bullets, collecting fruit, and taking on a boss at the end. The footage you're seeing isn't necessarily running at full speed, so keep that in mind, this is a harder one to emulate. You may be wondering why that's the case. It looks like a Super Nintendo game at first glance, and it has received some criticism because of that. To be honest though, the simple graphics were necessary for this game to run on the N64, and it's actually a really impressive feat. There's just so much going on all the time. You can have hundreds of bullets flying all around at once, plus swarms of enemies and destructible objects. It's all a lot for the console to process. I love how the game is all about destruction and frantic warfare between humans and mechs, but it's also full of brightly colored fruit and cute anime characters. We're even treated to a funny looking picture of Ultraman fighting Godzilla for some reason between levels. Like the name of its developer, Bangai-O really is a treasure, and if you enjoy shoot 'em ups, you should definitely give this one a try. Bakushou Jinsei 64, Mezase Resort O. Jinsei game is the Japanese version of the Life board game as we know it in many countries. Bakushou Jinsei 64 is but one of its many video game adaptations. It's a cute game with chibi characters that drive around the board in tiny cars. The music is relaxing and the gameplay itself is, well, somewhere between relaxing and boring. It's a board game, so what more do you expect? I guess I was hoping for some mini games or something, but nope, it's pretty much just a board game. But you can play it with up to 4 players, which is nice, or go solo in tournament mode. There's some aspects of the game that were very unfamiliar to me, like the stock exchange, which was never part of the board game I grew up with. It's interesting, but not something I can see myself playing again. Let's move on to something a little more exciting. Banjo Kazooie. Nowadays, kids only know Banjo and Kazooie from Smash, but if you're as old as I am, you know that Banjo Kazooie is one of the most beloved franchises on the Nintendo 64. Banjo Kazooie is a 3D platforming game with a big emphasis on exploration and collection. You play as both Banjo the bear and Kazooie the bird on an adventure that takes you through 9 different worlds on a quest to rescue Banjo's sister from the evil witch Gruntilda. It's a story that's full of humor and can easily be appreciated by kids and adults alike. The same can be said for every aspect of the game. It's one of the best looking and sounding games on the console with crisp, colorful graphics, long draw distances, and seriously catchy music. All of this draws you in and makes the environment so much more fun to explore. And you will be doing a ton of exploring in this game, trying to find all the hidden items scattered around each level, since you'll need most of these to open up subsequent levels. It's not always obvious where to find everything. There could be items in plain sight, hiding in nooks and crevices, or way up on a ledge somewhere. Maybe you won't find what you're looking for at all until you defeat a certain enemy or help a friendly NPC with something. This is a game you really want to take your time with and have some patience to enjoy. It's not something you want to rush through because you have to talk about 24 other games in one video, but here I am. There's just so much variety in the game, from the level designs to your character's basic abilities which add up as you progress through the game. It feels like every level presents a whole bunch of new gameplay elements, which is refreshing. It's held up exceptionally well over the course of time. Dare I say it's aged quite a bit more gracefully than Super Mario 64, which in many ways laid the framework for it. Banjo Tooie. Banjo Tooie takes place 2 years after the events of Banjo Kazooie. Grunty is brought back from the dead by her evil sisters and immediately kills Goggles. Yeah, the game's a bit darker than the original, but there is a happy ending and plenty of Rare's signature humor throughout the story. Banjo Tooie is massive. It has one of the largest game worlds on the N64, really pushing the hardware to its limits, sometimes resulting in low frame rates, unfortunately. But it's not just the environments that are impressive, there's even more variety in the things you can do this time around. You start off with all the abilities from the first game. In Banjo Kazooie, there was a steady stream of new moves to be acquired throughout the entire game, so the fact that you start out Banjo Tooie with all of those moves led me to believe that this sequel surely wouldn't introduce as many new mechanics as the original did. But I was wrong. You'll pick up all sorts of new moves this time around as well. There are also some very different gameplay elements in this game, like first-person shooter segments where you run around as Banjo and use Kazooie as a gun that shoots eggs. You can control other characters like Mumbo in certain parts of the game, and there's a ton of new magical forms to change into as well. Oh, and did I mention the new multiplayer modes? Yeah, there's a slew of 4-player minigames here. They really did add everything and the kitchen sink into this title. Honestly, the Banjo games deserve videos of their own as there's just so much to talk about. But alas, we have to move on. Bassmasters 2000. Oh neat, a fishing game. That's what you're thinking, right? Well, I haven't played many fishing games unless you count games with a fishing feature like Animal Crossing. But that being said, Bassmasters 2000 is absolutely, without question, a fishing game. In all honesty, it's a pretty deep fishing simulator. It features several real-world locations to fish in and a sort of mind-boggling amount of options to customize your day at the lake. You can change the time of day, the weather down to the exact temperature, on the wind and water, and so much more. You can create your own fisherman or woman and choose from a ton of different rods, reels, lines, hooks, and boats. As for the game modes, you can play a single exhibition game or partake in a more lengthy tournament. There's also a speed fishing mode, which is basically a time attack where every fish you catch adds to the clock. And finally, there's a casting game in which you practice casting your lure into targets spread out around the top of the water. It sort of feels like a Mario Party minigame or something. Aside from that, the game can be played with up to 2 players. It features camera controls that were impressive in its day, a cheesy announcer, and a rockabilly soundtrack composed by the legendary Tommy Tallarico. Bass Rush Eco Gear Power Worm Championship. What's this? Another fishing game? Neat! Bass Rush isn't nearly as deep or fully featured as Bassmasters 2000, but it has its own charm. It's a Japan exclusive game, so I have to put a disclaimer that there's probably a ton I'm missing out on. But from what I could tell, there's at least a free fishing mode and a tournament mode. You can play either a male or female character and choose from a ton of different lures. There are 3 lakes total, but each one is made up of a whole bunch of different fishing spots, so in reality there are dozens of areas in the game. My favorite part of it all was the intro video. I mean, just look at it. It's got a nice jazzy tune also. But yeah, it's another fishing game. Batman Beyond: Return of the Joker. You know how everyone hates on Superman 64 and remembers it for being one of the worst games of all time? Well, Batman Beyond got even worse reviews back in the day, if you can believe that. From my experience, however, I can say Batman Beyond is a much more enjoyable game than Superman 64. Still, that's not saying much. It's a side-scrolling beat-em-up with a few good ideas that just didn't turn out well. I'm a fan of this genre, but this game just doesn't feel right. Batman moves so awkwardly and clumsily. And this does nothing to help with the platforming sections where you have to avoid hazards on the screen. At least they tried to implement some cool features like giving Batman multiple suits with different abilities and weapons that can be switched out on the fly. But honestly, I would just prefer one suit with just a decent mix of features. The controls feel awkward, the character animations are abysmal, and the music is very repetitive. But none of it lasts too long. It's a short game that can be finished in about 30 minutes if you know what you're doing. I wouldn't have wanted to spend $60 on this back in the day, but despite its flaws, I didn't mind playing it for free. And I guess that's more than I can say about some other games. BattleTanx. As the name suggests, BattleTanx is a game where you get to battle with tanks. Go figure. It's actually much better than I expected. It has one of the craziest stories in any video game too. In the near future, the year 2001, the Earth has been devastated by a new virus that only affects females. 99.9% of women have died, and the remaining few have been rushed by the military to a quarantine spot in San Francisco. Renegade forces have risen up to take back their beloved family members, resulting in civil war and eventually nuclear destruction. Most of the world is laid to waste, and the few remaining women are placed on pedestals and protected by gangs of men who roam the streets in tanks. You play as Griffin Spade, an 80s action movie-like character, in a crazy tank-driven journey from New York to San Francisco to recover his fiancée. Along the way, you'll lay waste to any and all other gangs who try to stop you, and gradually build a team of your own. My goodness, what a setting. Now let's get to the gameplay. The whole thing revolves around driving tanks and blowing up enemies. Some levels simply require you to destroy all other tanks on the map, while others task you with getting from point A to point B. And still others play out like a game of capture the flag, only instead of taking flags, you're rescuing women from rival gangs and bringing them back to your base. Capture the babe, I like to call it. The different city locations make for some nice variety throughout the campaign, and the different types of objectives also keep things from getting boring. Add to this a heaping helping of weapons, shields, and other power-ups, and you've got yourself a good time. But I forgot to mention the coolest part of it all, the destructible environments. Each map is full of stuff you can blow up and demolish, including buildings and walls. Sometimes you'll blow up a wall to be surprised with an enemy or a cache of supplies. Although the campaign mode is good in itself, this is not strictly a single-player game. The game features several multiplayer modes for up to 4 players. Wreak havoc with your buddies in team-based or free-for-all games of deathmatch, capture the babe, and more. Honestly, this one surprised me. It's ridiculous, but a lot of fun. BattleTanx Global Assault. The tanks are back, and this time it's global. In the sequel to BattleTanx, Global Assault builds upon all the best aspects of the first game and does everything so much better. The tanks are much easier to control, and you just feel so much more powerful this time around. Everything feels faster and more intense, with tons of enemies all around you. The campaign is way more diverse, with levels that truly feel unique in their scenarios. The story is even crazier this time. 5 years after the events of the first game, you've managed to rescue your fiancé and even have a son. You're a leader, making the post-apocalyptic world a better place. That is until all hell breaks loose. I don't want to spoil anything, but there's some sort of supervillain character who appears to have mind control powers. They really went in a whole new direction here. Speaking of new directions, you won't simply be traveling across the US this time either. You'll be making your way to Europe, hence the name Global Assault. All of the original multiplayer modes make their return and then some. Basically everything is bigger and so much better this time around. Sadly, the story ends on a cliffhanger, and developer 3DO went out of business before the trilogy could ever be realized. Battlezone: Rise of the Black Dogs. I'll be honest, this one's a little beyond me. Battlezone: Rise of the Black Dogs is a hybrid real-time strategy, first-person vehicular combat, and third-person shooting game. There's a lot going on here. The game is set in an alternate history during the space race between the United States and the Soviet Union. Each nation is actually trying to build military bases on numerous planets, harvest resources, and control the solar system. Players can join the US, the USSR, or the fictional Black Dogs Army, each having its own unique campaign mode. You'll build and command units to carry out various tasks like harvesting resources, patrolling certain areas, and defending your base. In addition, you're free to drive or float around in vehicles of choice while exploring the landscape and gunning down enemy units. You also have the impressive ability to jump out of your vehicle at any time, snipe an enemy vehicle, and hijack it for yourself. You'll be playing on other planets and moons in low gravity environments, so the controls are purposefully floaty and take some getting used to. But it's definitely a deep and immersive experience. They really nailed the setting, storytelling, and overall feel of the game. There's a nice tutorial for simple folk like myself, and several multiplayer modes for up to 4 players. You'll need to have a little patience with this one and embrace its steep learning curve, but if you can do that, I think you'll be really impressed that something like this even exists on the N64. It was a surprise to me anyway. Beetle Adventure Racing. I never would have expected Beetle Adventure Racing to be one of the best racing games on the N64, but it actually is. If you don't believe me, you can refer to its 90% Metacritic score. VW Beetles hardly seem like cool racing cars, but the game never takes itself too seriously. What it delivers is a fast and fun arcade racing experience with tight gameplay and amazing level design. If you watched the last video in this series, you probably heard me complaining about other racing games that only had 6 tracks. Well, guess how many tracks are in this game? That's right, 6. But in this case, I don't really mind because all the tracks are enormous with multiple paths, shortcuts, and hidden areas, and dynamic elements that change from lap to lap. It's not uncommon for a single race to last about 10 minutes. And then there's the battle mode, which has its own set of smaller arena-style maps for up to 4 players. There's plenty of replay value here as you attempt to win championships and unlock all the cars and battle tracks. Sure, all the cars are Beetles, so they largely look the same, but they do perform differently and there are a couple of pretty fun secret cars. If you don't like being limited to Beetles, there is an Australian version of the game called HSV Adventure Racing, which is the same game with different cars, but we'll come back to that in a later video. Beetle Adventure Racing is a must-own racer on the N64. It put a big smile on my face and I still can't get over how much fun it is. Big Mountain 2000. Big Mountain 2000 is a snowboarding and skiing game that makes me really grateful for 1080 snowboarding. It's not a bad game really, it's rather enjoyable. I find a lot of charm in its blocky characters and the gameplay is pretty fun once you get the hang of it. It's not without its frustrations or shortcomings though. The way the riders handle is a little wonky. You really can't afford to pick up too much speed or else you will simply lose balance and fall down. Kinda unfortunate in a racing game where you instinctively want to go as fast as you can. The other aspect that was a bit disappointing is the amount of levels. A common complaint of mine it seems. There are only 4 summits in this game with 3 immediately available and 1 more that you can unlock by getting first place on all the other levels. In fact, you'll need to win 6 different challenges on each of these levels, thus milking them for all they're worth or adding replay value depending on your perspective. There's a straightforward race, a slalom, a giant slalom, which I guess has wider markers, and you'll have to complete all of these 3 challenges twice, once on skis and once on a snowboard. There's also a time trial mode in case you want to practice your best times, and a 2-player mode that lets you race a friend. It's certainly not a great game, but I enjoyed it for what it was. BioFreaks. BioFreaks is an edgy 3D fighting game set in a cyberpunk dystopia. All the characters have weird mechanically altered bodies ranging from cool to disturbing. The game was made by Midway, who was also known for handling the Mortal Kombat games back in the day, and the two share some similarities, mainly the gore and fatalities, but BioFreaks manages to do some cool things of its own as well. Each C button corresponds to moving a specific limb, much like Tekken. Characters also have ranged weapons attached to the A button and the ability to thrust into the air with the B button. Limbs can take damage and be blown off entirely. If you want to turn off the gore, there is an option for that too. Great, now it's fun for the whole family. The characters all have their share of cool attacks and personalities, and respectable move lists. You really need to take the time to learn each character and get good, or suffer my fate and get your butt kicked severely by the CPU. The environments have a lot to offer, like multiple platforms or hazards to watch out for. Game modes include your standard arcade, survival versus, and team battles. Overall, it's a pretty typical fighting game with a dark theme that you'll either love or hate. Personally, I kinda dig it, even though it's nothing to write home about. The N64 doesn't have a ton of fighting games anyway, so BioFreaks is worth giving a try. Blast Corps. I remember buying this game by accident as a kid. I thought it was a different game. What game I thought it was doesn't matter. But when I got home and booted up the cartridge, I was very confused and upset with myself. It kinda ruined the game for me. That being said, I am older, wiser, and willing to embrace Blast Corps for what it really is. And just what is it, you ask? It's actually one of Rare's earliest offerings on the N64, and it's quite a unique and beloved game, like all of Rare's games on the 64. It's sort of an isometric vehicular action game where you have to clear a path for an incoming truck that's carrying a nuclear bomb. In order to clear the way and avoid a devastating explosion, you have to destroy everything in its way before it collides with anything. This generally means leveling a bunch of buildings, and if you can destroy even more than is necessary, you get extra points. You do this by driving a variety of vehicles from bulldozers to giant mechs. In many cases, you can actually hop out of your vehicle and into another one if it better suits your needs or tastes. It starts out fairly easy but soon becomes more and more complicated as you go on through the game's 50+ levels. The graphics are nice, sporting a fully 3D world with an isometric view. The music is upbeat and you'll have friendly characters popping up to celebrate the destruction you've caused. It doesn't make any sense, but it makes you feel good. In the end, Blast Corps is a game I can recommend to just about everyone. Blues Brothers 2000. Blues Brothers 2000 is a platform game based on the 1998 movie of the same name. You'll have to forgive me for not seeing the film, but it's hard to imagine the two sharing many similarities. The game feels much more like a cartoon than anything else. And are you really telling me this is Dan Aykroyd? I think not. You start out in jail where you must break out with your friends and reunite your band in time for a big concert. Along the way, you'll explore a few other areas, including Chicago, a graveyard, and a swamp. The game borrows many elements from much better games. It has the controls of Super Mario 64 bundled with the collectathon nature of Banjo Kazooie. They even threw in a busted groove-like minigame, and it doesn't work out very well. Unfortunately, while drawing clear inspiration from these other titles, it just doesn't have any of that special sauce that those other games have. It's not terrible, but I didn't find any of it to be particularly fun either. There are so many better platformers on the N64 that it would be hard to find any reason to play this one, even if you did enjoy the movie. Body Harvest. Now this one surprised me. It's a title I had heard of, but really had no idea what it was. Body Harvest is an open-world action-adventure game where you play as a bio-enhanced super soldier trying to save the remnants of humanity from giant bug-like alien invaders. It's something of a mix between Earth Defense Force and Grand Theft Auto 3, with some calm RPG-like moments thrown into the mix. You get to run around the big open world on foot or freely hop into any one of several dozen types of vehicles as you visit different cities and towns, collect weapons and items to progress through the game, talk to NPCs, solve puzzles, travel through time, and shoot down tons and tons of aliens. It's really kind of mind-blowing. Sure, it's definitely aged, but Body Harvest is still a really impressive game that is well worth playing. I don't know why no one ever seems to talk about it. Bomberman 64 Arcade Edition. This is not the game we in the West know as Bomberman 64. That game is actually called Baku Bomberman in Japan, and we'll cover it next. This Bomberman 64 was exclusive to Japan, and it's also known as Bomberman 64 Arcade Edition. Unlike the other Bomberman games on the N64, this one is fully two-dimensional and stays true to the series' traditional gameplay. You have your classic single-player arcade mode where you must clear each stage of enemies and find the hidden exit before the time runs out. Then there's your typical Battle Royale mode where 4 players fight to the death in one of several stages. But then there are some extra surprises as well, like a couple different puzzle modes, and a weird co-op multiplayer tandem mode where one player makes the character walk while the other player makes the character place bombs. It honestly doesn't sound very fun, but I haven't tried it out myself. Then there's the Bomberman Park mode, which puts you in sort of a Bomberman carnival where you can walk around, talk to NPCs, and play a variety of mini-games. If you're a fan of Bomberman, you'll be sure to enjoy this version of the game. It's just a shame it never made its way to the West, since the titles we did get over here were very different and somewhat divisive. Bomberman 64, or Baku Bomberman. Alright, so this is the game most of us know as Bomberman 64. The one that's called Baku Bomberman in Japan. It was Bomberman's first venture into 3D, and all I can say is that it's a mixed bag. It does look nice, but it's just not nearly as fun as the more traditional Bomberman games. No wonder the series would eventually return to form in future generations. No pun intended. Bomberman 64 is more of an adventure game with bombs. You play through several worlds, blowing up bad guys and looking for ways to progress through stages. No more cross-shaped explosions or grid-like levels. Everything is fairly open and bombs explode in a round shape. You start out with the ability to kick and throw bombs, so there's not as much of a need to search for power-ups. You also have the ability to pick up a bomb and pump it up to an enormous size, which is useful for blowing up extra large obstacles. Multiplayer is usually the best part of Bomberman games, but even it isn't nearly as fun as it normally is due to the changes in the formula. It could be fun with the right group of friends, but most Bomberman fans will surely find it lacking. Though not as lacking as Bomberman Hero, which skips multiplayer altogether, but we'll get there in a minute. Bomberman 64, The Second Attack. Bomberman 64, The Second Attack, or Baku Bomberman 2, is a sequel to the last game we looked at, and it's by all accounts a much better game. It takes the best aspects of Bomberman 64 and adds many more traditional elements back into the mix. The cross-shaped explosions are back and many of the areas have a more grid-like design, while also having wide open 3D areas. The story mode is actually way more compelling this time around, with more linear, action-packed level designs, bosses, and a cute sidekick that helps move things along. Multiplayer mode represents all of these changes as well, with a mix of traditional and open maps and tons of unlockable characters and game modes. I just hate those awful revenge ghosts, but they can be turned off in the settings. Honestly, Bomberman 64 The Second Attack is a good game, but be warned, it's pretty rare, so obtaining the physical game cartridge is going to cost you a pretty penny. Bomberman Hero. I went into this game with very low expectations, knowing that it's the least conventional Bomberman game so far, and that there's no multiplayer support. The multiplayer battle mode has always been my reason to play any Bomberman game, and I've always felt very lukewarm about single player offerings in the franchise. All that being said, I had a good time with Bomberman Hero. You'll just have to set aside any preconceptions you may have about the series, because this is something totally different. It's a 3D action platform game starring the White Bomber. This is the only Bomberman game I've played with the ability to jump. You'll be doing tons of careful jumping from platform to platform as you run around through some fairly straightforward levels. You can throw bombs, set them down, and kick them at enemies. There's a fair amount of challenge as the game progresses. I fell off of cliffs many times, due in part to a camera that isn't always in your favor. You're mostly going from point A to point B, but there are plenty of gems to try and collect, and you'll often have to search for hidden items like keys to open doors. It's nothing like, say, Banjo Kazooie. It feels much more like the kinds of linear action platform games I grew up with. This genre has always been a favorite of mine, so I think that's why I had such a surprisingly good time with this title. No, it's not perfect, and I still wish it had a battle mode tacked on. But for what it is, it's a satisfying action platform game and one of the better single player experiences I've had with the series. I would love to see them come out with a new Bomberman game in this style, but with a very traditional battle mode on the side. Bottom of the Ninth. There's not a whole lot I can say about Bottom of the Ninth. It's a baseball game from Konami. This N64 version is a 1999 port of the 1996 PlayStation and Saturn counterparts. You can play an exhibition game against another player or the CPU, or play through a whole simulated season. The game's graphics really don't hold up even to other baseball games of its era, but the gameplay is pretty standard and decently fun. That is, if you're into 20-something-year-old sports games. The game features hundreds of real athletes from the time, but apparently they couldn't get permission to use any real MLB logos or team names, which is interesting. Otherwise, yeah, it's another old baseball game. Not the best of its class, but not terrible. Brunswich Circuit Pro Bowling. Brunswich Circuit Pro Bowling is a realistic bowling simulator. A little too realistic. It's just not very fun. You can play as one of several real-life bowlers or create your own. No females allowed, mind you. Join a tournament or play an exhibition match with up to 5 other players in one of many bowling alleys from across the world. It all sounds decent, but it gets boring very fast. I'll admit I didn't pick up some of the nuances of the game. I still don't know how to spin the ball, and I can't seem to find any control guide or manual on the internet either. You do have different bowling balls and lanes that handle differently, adding even more depth to the rather simple stop the meter at the appropriate time gameplay style. On top of everything, the game is just plain ugly no matter how you look at it. This isn't even a matter of age. The graphics were criticized just as much back in '99. For the hardcore bowlers out there, this might be worthwhile, but for most others, I'd give it a hard pass. Bumble. Bumble is a flight combat game set in the Insect Kingdom. Thanks to a chemical spill at a nuclear power plant in London, the nearby ecosystem's insects have been seeing mutation. The worst of the insects, known as the herd, have decided to take over the rest of the insect kingdom through violent means. It's up to you, Bumble, to put a stop to the herd and save the rest of the insect kingdom. This basically means flying around and shooting stuff. You'll be engaging swarms of enemies high and low in dogfights, blowing up machinery, clearing paths, and collecting a variety of weapons, from machine guns to grenade launchers and more. Bumble has one of the catchiest theme songs in all of gaming, and its upbeat energy carries on throughout the game.
What about now? It's time to rock with the biggity bump, bumble. Bump to the bump to the bump to the bass, bump to the bump to the bumble.
I also love how the flying bugs sound like airplanes as they're being shot down. It always makes me chuckle a bit. The controls can take some getting used to and the graphics are notoriously foggy, but there's still a fun time to be had here. In addition to the single player story, there's a couple of 2-player modes, including a standard dogfight and a soccer type game. I feel like this is a pretty slept on title and it's well worth checking out. Bust-A-Move 2 Arcade Edition. Bust-A-Move 2, or more correctly, Puzzle Bobble 2, is just one entry in a long line of classic puzzle games by Taito. Featuring the beloved Bub and Bob of Bubble Bobble fame, the object of the game is to shoot colored bubbles up from the bottom of the screen in order to create matching groups of 3 or more. You'll have to work efficiently as the ceiling gradually drops, and if any of the bubbles reach the bottom, it's game over. You can also chain combos by breaking a row of bubbles with alternate colored bubbles attached to it, causing them to fall. It's hard to put it into words, but you've undoubtedly seen this type of gameplay before, as so many others have copied it over the years. There's a puzzle mode in which you can go through a series of pre-built puzzle levels. Then there's a standard versus mode where you and an opponent, either a CPU or another player, face off to see who can finish their side first or survive the longest. Executing chains on your side of the screen will cause more bubbles to appear on your opponent's side. I hate to say it, but if you've played one Puzzle Bobble game, you've pretty much played them all. And that's okay, I'm a fan of the series and I've enjoyed them for decades. I don't think I'll stop enjoying them anytime soon either. Bust-A-Move 99. Trivia time. What do Bust-A-Move 99, Bust-A-Move 3DX, and Puzzle Bobble 64 all have in common? That's right, they're the same game with different regional titles. How confusing is this? No matter what you call it, this is just the third Puzzle Bobble game and the sequel to the last game we looked at. It's largely similar to Bust-A-Move 2, but with a few new features added. You still have the same puzzle modes and versus modes, but this time up to 4 players can play. You also have a selection of characters to choose from, like an homage to Street Fighter's Ryu, a drunken mahjong gambler, and Taito's classic beat-em-up hero, Sonic Blastman. There are tons of nods to other arcade games and even a joke about the confusing regional game title. I love it. Gameplay-wise, we see the introduction of rainbow bubbles, which turn into whatever color happens to pop next to it, and some other kinds of nodes that can add a lot more challenge and make the levels longer. One of the coolest new features is the ability to create and play your very own levels. I had a bit of fun creating something that just might resemble the devil. It wasn't intentional. The new features, updated graphics, and overall charm make this the best version of Puzzle Bobble on the N64 and a great pickup for fans of puzzle games in general. And there you have it, those were all 25 Nintendo 64 games starting with the letter B. Next time we'll take a look at every game that starts with the letter C, and maybe, just maybe, we'll get through the whole alphabet before I'm old and dead. These videos do take a long time to make, so I will be sprinkling some other videos in between. If there's something else you'd like to see on the channel, let me know. Thanks so much for watching, I'll see you next time.